Israel and Hezbollah are at war. After nearly a year of saber-rattling, mutual escalation and frenzied attempts by the international community to draw down hostilities, the border between Israel and its northern neighbor, Lebanon, is now just as much a war zone as the Gaza Strip. Over the course of the last 2 weeks, the world has watched, transfixed, as mass sabotage attacks, waves of rocket assaults, and a crushing air offensive have taken what little hope remained for this part of the world and stomped it down into the dirt. In today's special episode, we'll be presenting the first in a two-part series on the current conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, even though we are increasingly confident that these two parts is not going to be where today's story ends. In this episode, we're going to be diving into the depths of Israel's infiltration of Hezbollah's communications network. We'll be exploring just how Israel pulled off the infiltration feat of the decade. We'll be analyzing the start of what is almost certainly a new Israel-Hezbollah war. And finally, we'll set up the sequel and get ready for the story to take an even darker turn. Because this is the story of Israel's new war with Hezbollah, how it started, how it's going, and where it's going to go from here. The attack came without warning at approximately 3:30 p.m. local time all across Lebanon on Tuesday, the 17th of December. At that time, thousands of handheld pager devices started beeping all at once, seemingly without any reason to cause concern, but certainly indicating an urgent enough notice that those pagers should be checked. Not every pager in Lebanon started going off at once. Instead, just one type was receiving the message, a new pager model called the AR924. It's produced by a company called BAC Consulting under the branding and distribution of a Taiwanese company, Gold Apollo. But in Lebanon, the AR924 pager wasn't just any other device picked up by random shoppers at the nearest electronics store. The people who carried that particular pager, for the most part, had been given the devices by a group that exerts supreme influence in Lebanon, the non-state militant organization Hezbollah. But although Hezbollah has acquired its new pagers from a friendly-looking, trustworthy company from Taiwan, they either didn't realize or didn't care that the company BAC Consulting was the one that built the pagers, not Gold Apollo. What Hezbollah certainly didn't find out until it was too late was that BAC Consulting, despite being based in Hungary, was an Israeli shell company. The people behind it happened to work for one of the most dangerous and ruthless intelligence organizations on the planet. BAC Consulting did build normal pagers, and Hezbollah is an organization whose highest leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has insisted that his members use pagers for years owing to suspicions that cell phones were too easily hijacked or exploited by Israel. So regardless of any precise gaps of knowledge, missed signs or signals, or lapses in strategic judgment, the outcome, when those pagers started beeping on September the 17th, was unavoidable by the time Israel's trap was finally sprung. 12 people would be reported dead in the immediate aftermath after the small explosive devices concealed within Hezbollah's new pagers detonated following several seconds of a sustained beeping alert. Close to 3,000 more would be injured, including several hundred being wounded critically. Because of the small size of the explosive devices, no more than a couple of ounces of a compound called PTN, they weren't nearly so fatal as to cause mass casualties in each individual blast. Instead, people standing near to a person who had been holding their pager when it blew up were largely unharmed. But because of the signal emitting from the pager and the nature of the device itself, injuries came disproportionately to people's hands, faces, eyes, and the sides of their torsos, or where they might have carried the device on their hip. According to some reports, the devices would beep for a few seconds and then detonate when people were likely to be checking the message that had come in. According to others, the pagers beeped and showed an error code, only exploding when their users pressed the buttons to clear the code, thus further increasing the likelihood of people holding them in their hands near to their faces when the devices blew up. In possible support of that claim, it appears that not all of the explosions happened simultaneously. Instead, they continued for about an hour and a half once the attack began. Some 150 more hospitals across Lebanon would receive victims of the attacks, streaming in all at once with injuries of varying severity. Some among the 12 killed were civilians, including 2 children, the 9-year-old daughter of one Hezbollah member and the 11-year-old son of another. Also among those killed were multiple healthcare workers from Beirut who had used the pagers, and the son of a Lebanese parliamentarian who was loyal to the Hezbollah organization. They, like the vast majority of those injured, were Hezbollah members, with Hezbollah's leader Hassan Nasrallah later confirming that about 5,000 of the devices had been purchased and distributed to lower-ranking members of the organization. A large proportion of the wounded were in or around Beirut at the time of the attack. While a range of injuries were sustained by those who had been targeted, eye injuries were among the most common, second only to blown-off fingers and thumbs. One ophthalmologist at a Beirut hospital, Dr. Elias Warak, speaking with the BBC, attested that at his hospital, over 60% of patients had at least one eye removed. Quoting him now, "Some of the patients, we had to remove both eyes. It kills me. In my past 25 years in practice, I've never removed as many eyes as I did yesterday." In the hours immediately after the attack, no nation or non-state actor took credit. But even before the dust had settled, experts all across the world were in agreement on who was most likely responsible. That would be the nation of Israel, the longtime archenemy of the Hezbollah organization. To be more precise, such an attack would have probably fallen under the domain of its most feared and ruthless spy agency, the Foreign Intelligence Service, Mossad. At first, spokespeople for the Israeli Defense Forces, or IDF, declined to comment on the incident in a move characteristic of Israeli institutions after a major intelligence feat like this one. By the following day, the chief of staff of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, admitted that, quote, "We have many capabilities that we have not yet activated. We have seen some of these things. It seems to me that we are well prepared, and we are preparing these plans going forward." Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant publicly referred to the pager explosions as, quote, "excellent achievements" by the IDF and Israeli intelligence on the following day, and according to US officials, Israel quickly claimed credit for the attack in private conversations. The US, Israel's primary international backer, attested that its own intelligence and political leaders had been given no indication of the impending attack before it began. Their only signal had been a vague and cryptic call from Israel's Minister of Defense to his colleagues in the US, warning of an attack just minutes before it began. A visiting top advisor from America's Biden administration, Amos Hochstein, had been in Israel the day prior to the attack and met with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, but was never told of the impending operation. Now, we should be abundantly clear at this moment. The implications of Israel's infiltration and attack are complex and in many ways quite concerning. We will be addressing those elements of the story in just a moment. Nor is this where the story ends, as the runtime of this episode probably gives away. This is a story that is really only just beginning. But we have to take a moment and zoom out from the specific circumstances of Israel's hostilities with Hezbollah to acknowledge the sheer magnitude and scope of the Israeli plot. We'll give the news again in de-identified terms to explain just what we mean. A nation involved in a long and quickly escalating conflict against a non-state actor based on the soil of another sovereign nation just secretly built and distributed some 5,000 well-camouflaged miniature explosive devices into the ranks of its adversary before performing a coordinated mass detonation that caused thousands of casualties without any of its own personnel sustaining so much as a minor injury. That is one of the most complex and the most stunning intelligence infiltrations and sabotage attacks of all time, taking the time-tested assassination tool of planted explosives and employing it on a truly industrial scale. That dimension of Israel's attack will likely be spoken about for decades to come, long after this particular round of conflict with Hezbollah has concluded. But in the wake of the attack, discussion around the world was more than Israel's sleight of hand. Instead, it was received partially with celebration from Israel's most ardent supporters, and particularly with deep concern for both the nature of its tactics and for the line of thinking that had brought Israel to that point. While Hezbollah is regarded across much of the world as a terrorist organization, and they're referred to almost universally as a militant organization at the very least, they're not similar to other militant terror groups like Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State. Hezbollah is deeply integrated to society in Lebanon, and while they do draw on the support of tens of thousands of fighters, those aren't the only people that fill their ranks. Doctors and medical personnel swear allegiance to Hezbollah, so do school teachers and youth leaders. Local political candidates across much of the country are Hezbollah members, and as are large numbers of civil servants. Some of those people would be expected to take up arms in support of Hezbollah if the group went to war, but that is far from their intended role. As it happens, the pages distributed to Hezbollah members in advance of the attack didn't appear to go exclusively to members of the group's militant wing, far from it in fact. Instead, they were largely sent to members of the civilian side of Hezbollah, with numerous debilitating injuries to medical personnel, among others. From a strategic perspective, putting aside the war legality issue that we'll discuss in a moment, there is an argument that attacking civil members of Hezbollah will degrade the group's overall capabilities. But it certainly can't be framed as an attack on Hezbollah's fighting force alone. How much that fighting force was even diminished at all by the attack, that remains an open question. The sweeping nature of the attack and the high rates of casualties among non-fighting Hezbollah personnel and civilians have led to condemnation of the attack for many reasons, but perhaps most of all, its indiscriminate nature. But we really have to be perfectly clear here. Indiscriminate, although a damning term, is not the correct one here. Like the follow-on attacks we're about to discuss by Israel against Hezbollah, and like so many of the IDF's attacks on Hamas in Gaza, this pager attack was targeted, even if on a large scale. But what it also was an attack that accepted astronomically high risk of collateral damage, deaths or injuries to children, bystanders, and deaths or injuries of people like medics and doctors who are exempted from such attacks by international law. Israel is a signatory to a range of treaties and international legal codes that would render its own attack illegal under international law, including codes that prohibit the use of booby traps and unreliably targeted explosive devices. Said the UN's High Commissioner for Human Rights, Volker Turk, after the attack, quote, "Simultaneous targeting of thousands of individuals, whether civilians or members of armed groups, without knowledge as to who was in possession of the targeted devices, their location, and surroundings at the time of the attack, violates international human rights law and, to the extent applicable, international humanitarian law." The quote ends. Now, we should again be abundantly clear here. We do not bring up ideas like war crimes or international law to give the false impression that those waging modern warfare around the world, including Israel's conflict with Hezbollah and its war in Gaza, have any intention of being drawn back or restrained by those standards. Instead, it's something we urge our viewers to keep in mind as we zoom out, look at the bigger picture behind this attack, and turn our attention to all that has happened since. It's safe to say that short of Bibi Netanyahu stepping up to a podium and saying, "Oh, we're going to blow up several thousand pages in Lebanon," there's very little that Israel could have said or done to make the specifics of its September the 17th attack appear as anything less than a complete shock. But zoom out from the specifics of the operation, and the writing has been on the wall for several weeks that Israel, for better or for worse, was looking to shift its military attention away from the war in Gaza and toward Lebanon. Hezbollah's military threat has been a primary concern for Israel for quite a while, stemming partly from Hezbollah's near-daily attacks into Israel in solidarity with Hamas, ever since Hamas launched its October the 7th attacks, and partly from the results of those attacks. Most of Hezbollah's potential to do harm is concentrated in and around northern Israel, where its short-range rockets can sometimes carry out successful strikes before Israel's close-range air defense system, the Iron Dome, can intercept them. Northern Israel is also within range of potential ground assaults by Hezbollah operatives if the group chose to attempt an October 7th-style attack on a larger scale. As a result, tens of thousands of Israelis have been forced to leave their homes and communities as internally displaced people, and their return to the north has become a primary concern for the Israeli government. With northern Israel in mind, leaders within Israel have spent weeks signaling a turn northward. The country's foremost opposition leader, Benny Gantz, offered on September the 8th that, quote, "We have enough forces to deal with Gaza, and we should concentrate on what is going on in the north. The time of the north has come, and actually, I think we are late on this," said Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant that same day, quoting again, "We are preparing for anything that may happen in the north. The shift of the center of gravity can happen quickly and can also involve you in a short period of time," with the "you" he was referring to there being a group of soldiers to whom he directly delivered that statement. On September the 16th, just one day before the pager attacks, Prime Minister Netanyahu announced that the safe return of northern Israel's residents to their homes had been made an official war goal by a security cabinet. That same day, Defense Minister Gallant had expressed to a top US envoy that, quoting from a statement after their conversation, "The possibility for an agreement is running out as Hezbollah continues to tie itself to Hamas and refuses to end the conflict. Therefore, the only way left to ensure the return of Israel's northern communities to their homes will be via military action." The quote ends. Over the last several weeks, Israel has begun to reposition major military assets to its northern regions, including the formidable 98th Division and its paratrooper and shock troop elements. But for Israel to launch a war with Hezbollah is a difficult prospect, and one where the barriers are far greater than they were in Gaza after October 7th, where the IDF, despite major Hamas resistance, could clear out Gaza district by district. Hezbollah is a similarly committed, similarly asymmetric foe, but they are far larger and far more complicated to dismantle. Among the group's assets are supposedly tens of thousands of foot soldiers, including thousands of combat veterans with intense fighting experience in Syria and high-level commandos who Israeli special operators regard as direct peers in battle. They're believed to possess up to 150,000 rockets. They operate in well-organized combat groups on sovereign territory that they know very well, and they both share a closer relationship with Iran and can accept far greater financial, military, and personnel support via land corridors through Iraq and Syria. If the Israel-Hamas war was taxing for the IDF, then an Israel-Hezbollah war in 2024 promises to be 10 times worse at a minimum. But as both Israel and Hezbollah know, Hezbollah's ability to meet Israel as a large-scale asymmetric insurgency is contingent on its ability to, 1, use the element of surprise to launch weapons against Israel, and 2, lure the IDF onto Lebanese soil where Hezbollah figures can present a much greater threat. And as Israel has increasingly shown, it has the ability to disrupt Hezbollah's capacity for surprise attacks while not sending its troops into Lebanon directly. Take, for example, an exchange in late August when Hezbollah did launch several dozen rockets into Israel, but Israel used about 100 jet fighters to destroy a far larger number of what it claimed were other rocket launch tubes primed to hit Israel much harder than Hezbollah ultimately did. From the air, Israel has launched a range of other airstrikes in the week since, killing high-level Hezbollah operatives and some of their foot soldiers. Even before the pager attacks ever took place, these were valuable military steps for Israel to preemptively dismantle Hezbollah's ability to start a conflict on Hezbollah's own terms. But they weren't enough to make northern Israel safe or to deter large-scale Hezbollah attacks that could have come in retaliation. Now, conventional wisdom on the Israel-Hezbollah conflict, at least internationally, has held for months that the best way to get Hezbollah to back down from their escalating tensions with Israel would be for Israel to establish a ceasefire with Hamas in Gaza. But with ceasefire talks at a stalemate, that appears to be getting more and more intractable by the day. That potential outcome has gone from a reasonable goal to a long shot to a highly unlikely prospect. Without a Hamas ceasefire, Hezbollah's own military engagements with Israel appeared sure to escalate sooner or later. And if a large war was coming, only a handful of options appeared available to Israel to try and turn the situation to its advantage. Israel could try to get Hezbollah's key backer, Iran, to encourage Hezbollah to disengage, but that outcome was extremely unlikely. It could engage in much larger preemptive strikes, more devastating than the ones we've just mentioned, before launching a rapid assault, but that posed a major problem. Launching a ground assault at all would embroil Israel in exactly the complex asymmetric sort of war that would make its Gaza operations look straightforward by comparison. Or Israel could take the middle path, to take a series of military actions that would make it harder and harder for Hezbollah to justify engaging in a war where it appeared underprepared, under-equipped, or simply outmatched. Blowing up, say, several thousand pages and taking several thousand potential Hezbollah fighters out of the fight before it ever began is certainly a good representation of such an approach, if that was indeed the intent of Israel's leaders. But it was far from the only step Israel has taken over the last few weeks to do more than just destroying rockets the IDF believed were primed for launch. Instead, Israel has been working overtime to stack the deck in its own favor before that potential large-scale conflict broke out. Israel has a long history of concocting operations to degrade the capabilities of its adversaries, including prior booby trap attacks like planting bombs in Hamas cell phones, sabotage attacks against Iran's nuclear program, and international airstrikes killing the leaders of enemy organizations. Just this year, those airstrikes have killed high-ranking Hezbollah members, as well as high-level Iranian officials and the political leader of Hamas. Recently, Israel has engaged in more direct assaults on Hezbollah's support network, launching precision attacks on purported stores of Hezbollah weapons in Lebanon and taking direct action to destroy meetings between Hezbollah officials and their Iranian allies, often in Syria. In one particularly eye-catching operation that's gone vastly underreported, on September the 8th of this year, Israeli commandos carried out a raid in the Syrian town of Masyaf in Hama province. The nearly unprecedented ground raid via helicopter airdrop of special forces operatives saw dozens of commandos breach and destroy a critical facility that manufactures short and medium-term missiles for Hezbollah. Several Iranian special forces commandos were purportedly taken captive, and substantial sensitive intelligence was extracted as well. Israel's destruction of the several thousand Hezbollah pages might appear at first glance as if it might have been designed with different intentions, disrupting the early stage of a Hezbollah defense and causing unexpected mass casualties to clear the way for an Israeli assault. But according to some sources within Syria, the pager attack itself was executed on Tuesday the 17th, not because of any particularly advantageous timing, but because Israeli officials had feared that Hezbollah might have discovered the operation or been about to do so. If that's the case, and Israel had needed to use its explosives sooner than later, then their value to deter future Hezbollah actions against Israel simply cannot be overstated. According to one US official speaking to Axios, Israel had described its pager explosions after the fact to the US as a, quote, use it or lose it opportunity. After Israeli intelligence had raised concerns to Israel's leaders that Hezbollah might find the explosives, or at the very least could already be on Israel's trail, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his civil and military leaders signed off on an immediate attack instead. That being said, we've also got to emphasize that in reality, Hezbollah's mid-level leaders were still distributing their new pages to their underlings within just hours of the attack, indicating that even if some within the Hezbollah apparatus might have had suspicions, there were no such reservations further down the chain of command. Now, the attack and its impact constitute a difficult new reality for Hezbollah, that Israel has laid traps in unexpected and potentially shocking ways, and that Hezbollah simply is not prepared for what might come next. And Israel, knowing full well that it had created that perception across Hezbollah and across Lebanon, had a golden opportunity to do what ultimately came next, to reinforce the degree to which it could impose its will on Hezbollah while Hezbollah remained unable to strike back. Israel's next move came one day after the pager attacks on Wednesday, September the 18th, in what amounted to a near carbon copy repeat attack. This time, the handheld electronic devices in Israel's crosshairs weren't pagers, but two-way radios or walkie-talkies used by Hezbollah military and civil operatives. The two-way radios were counterfeits, made to look like a particular model made by the ICOM company, but clearly not actual ICOMs, as the model's production and the production of their batteries had been discontinued about a decade ago. The ones Hezbollah had in its possession had been obtained by the group at about the same time as its new pagers, and Israel's choice to detonate the devices was likely due to the same use-it-or-lose-it concern they had cited for their pager attack. Notably, several residential solar power systems and biometric fingerprint readers also exploded across Lebanon, although it's unclear whether those were separate explosions or triggered by nearby handheld radio explosions. This time, there were far fewer explosions, on the scale of hundreds rather than thousands, but the death toll was nearly double what it had been in the pager attack, rising to 25 by the following day. That might have been a byproduct of more powerful explosives in the somewhat larger devices, or a byproduct of the higher incidence rate of their users raising the devices to their heads before detonation occurred. The majority of those injured, however, appeared to have injuries primarily to their stomachs and hands. Over 600 others were wounded, including some at a funeral organized by Hezbollah for those killed during the pager explosions of the prior day. This time, casualties were not concentrated just in Beirut, but in southern Lebanon, likely indicating a higher incidence rate of the devices being used by Hezbollah's militant members who've been operating in that area for months and launching frequent small-scale attacks on Israel. But the lower casualty numbers also reflected the fact that many of the radios were still in warehouse storage, kept aside in advance of a potential full-scale war with Israel, and thus further reflecting that Israel likely detonated its bombs prematurely to do what damage they could, rather than see them found out during investigations after the pager attack a day prior. In the wake of the handheld radio attack, Israel's highest officials continued avoiding direct acknowledgement of what their intelligence services had achieved, but sent clear signals to both Lebanon and the global public that the surprises were not finished yet. The army chief of the IDF, Herzi Halevi, promised in a public statement that Israel had a range of capabilities that it hadn't, quote, activated yet. Whereas the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, agreed that Israel is, quote, at the start of a new phase in the war. An Israeli intelligence source speaking to Axios offered in regard to the pager and two-way radio attacks, quoting here, the goal was to convince Hezbollah that it is in its interest to disconnect itself from Hamas and cut a separate deal for ending the fighting with Israel, regardless of a ceasefire in Gaza. The attack also prompted widespread speculation, including from UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, that the device explosions may have been planned as only the first wave in advance of a major military operation. It's not hard to see the potential impact of the sabotage operation if, say, Hezbollah had decided to launch an all-out war with Israel, only for thousands upon thousands of pagers and handheld radios to detonate all at once, causing thousands of casualties on and around the front lines and clearing the way for the IDF. But now, with Israel seemingly forced to detonate early, there was another side to the coin. Israel had caused thousands of casualties, as it had clearly intended, and now it had opened a critical window to heighten and amplify its attempts to deter a war at all. Israel had been laying the groundwork and sending the international signals that it showed it was primed for such a large-scale show of force to make Hezbollah back down, and now its opening salvo was launched. The following days would show that even if Israel hadn't sprung its trap exactly as planned, it would capitalize nonetheless. The next day, September the 19th, would see wide-ranging and intense Israeli airstrikes all across Lebanon. These were among the most severe since the October 7th attack, and over a 2-hour span, they saw Israeli jets strike hundreds of firing sites where multiple rocket launchers were stationed. According to the IDF, those rocket launchers were loaded and pointed at Israel at the time of the airstrikes, and a massive rocket attack against Israel's territory was purportedly imminent. Southern Lebanon, in particular, took a shellacking, a target that would align with Hezbollah's use of short-range rockets, and while no casualties were reported in Lebanon, Israel claimed the destruction of about 100 rocket launchers in the south, along with a handful of other targets. That same day, Israeli warplanes had already asserted their power in another way. During a televised address, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah had insisted that Israel's handheld device bombings had, quote, crossed all red lines, and said that they, quote, could be considered war crimes or a declaration of war. Yet, as he spoke, Israeli warplanes sent full power to their engines and sent huge sonic booms thundering across Beirut, so massive that they could be heard in Nasrallah's address. The subtext was clear, not just because Israel has done similar things in the past, but because the fundamental meaning simply couldn't be missed. We can destroy you anytime we want. On the 20th, Israeli airstrikes would be no more forgiving to Hezbollah than the prior several days had been, but on that day, it was personnel that were back on the IDF's target list. This time, the airstrike came in Beirut, only Israel's second airstrike on the Lebanese capital this year and the third in several years. In the crosshairs was an apartment block, one that would be leveled to the ground, and like Israel's handheld device attacks, this strike would be targeted, but it would accept high civilian casualties to justify eliminating Israel's adversaries. 45 people would be killed in the strike, with 68 injured and over a dozen still missing at the time of writing. The dead would include 3 children and 7 women. But also among the dead, per Hezbollah, were 16 of the group's members, including 10 that Israel described as Hezbollah commandos. 2, in particular, were especially important: Ibrahim Akil and Ahmed Webe. Akil, the strike's primary target, was believed to be the head of Hezbollah's elite fighting force, Radwan, while he did double duty as Hezbollah's head of operations and triple duty as an informal chief of staff for the organization. The United States has offered a $7 million reward for information about him for years after he had helped to plan the 1983 U.S. Embassy bombing in Beirut, another 1983 attack in Beirut that killed 241 American military personnel, and kidnappings of Americans and Germans. According to Israel, Akil would likely have led an October 7th-style attack against northern Israel in the event of an all-out war. With his death, Hezbollah suffered mass disruption to its command structure and will likely need to rethink its approach to any hostilities with Israel. Unlike other Hezbollah leaders who've recently been killed by Israel, Akil is one of few who is not easily replaced. Across the following 2 days, Israel would continue its strikes like clockwork, extending the new phase of its Hezbollah operations into a predictable, albeit highly destructive rhythm. On Saturday the 21st, about 180 more targets were bombarded, including, per Israel, thousands of individual rocket launch tubes. On Sunday, Israel would take pains to signal its willingness to continue combat operations for as long as was necessary, threatening that Israel would activate capabilities it hasn't yet shown and vowing to hammer home the reality of Hezbollah's difficult situations via military means for as long as was necessary. During those days, Hezbollah would launch strikes of its own. On Saturday the 21st, per an IDF spokesman, quote, dozens of rockets hit Israel, which destroyed homes, cars, and communities. Israel claimed that Hezbollah had launched a total of 150 rockets, cruise missiles, and drones in an assault with limited damage caused by hits and falling debris. On Sunday, in the early morning hours, Hezbollah claimed that it hit the Ramat David airbase in Israel with 2 barrages of missiles, although Israel claimed to have intercepted both. And that same day, Hezbollah claimed to have attacked a separate military-industrial complex near the northern Israeli city of Haifa. And Monday, September the 23rd, would become the single deadliest day of attacks by Israel against Lebanon since the 2006 war between Israel and Hezbollah. On that day, Lebanese citizens in the southern parts of the country received a video statement from Netanyahu himself warning them to leave areas where Hezbollah may be storing weapons and insisting that, quote, Israel's war is not with you, it's with Hezbollah. For too long, it has been using you as human shields. It placed rockets in your living rooms and missiles in your garage. To defend our people against Hezbollah strikes, we must take out these weapons. The IDF also sent about 80,000 text messages to Lebanese numbers, urging those who saw the messages to leave the area immediately. During the course of the day, southern Lebanon became an evacuation zone with thousands upon thousands of people trying to escape on gridlocked roads. But by then, the IDF's operation had already begun, and with Israeli warplanes streaking overhead in a massive show of force, the bombs began to drop. Israel would claim successful strikes on over 1,000 targets, including a targeted strike in Beirut intended for a senior Hezbollah official. Hezbollah would attempt strikes of its own, launching about 200 rockets over the course of the day and sending dozens of missiles at a northern Israeli military base, cumulatively causing a few injuries due to shrapnel. As of Tuesday, after the strikes concluded, Lebanon's health ministry stated that the death toll stood at 558 people, including no fewer than 50 children. 1,835 more people were reported wounded and tens of thousands have fled and were now considered internally displaced. Per the Lebanese health ministry, it was Lebanon's deadliest day for reasons associated to violence since the country's 15-year civil war, which had concluded all the way back in 1990. Said Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in the wake of the strikes, quoting here, "On this day we have taken out of order tens of thousands of rockets and precise munition. What Hezbollah has built over a period of 20 years since the Second Lebanon War is in fact being destroyed by the IDF." Among the destroyed munitions, per Israel, were long-range cruise missiles, explosive drones, and especially large rockets across about 1,300 targets in total. According to the IDF, much of that weaponry was hidden in people's homes. Senior Israeli officials denied that their intent was to clear out land in order to surge IDF ground troops and create a buffer zone. Per a senior official interviewed by the BBC, their strike aimed to and accomplished three objectives: to degrade Hezbollah's ability to attack Israel with rockets and missiles, to force its fighters away from the border, and to destroy infrastructure Hezbollah militants have placed in southern Lebanon to attack Israel. The events of Monday the 23rd were the deadliest and most stunning by a order of magnitude since Hezbollah began its regular attacks on Israel on October the 8th of last year, and since Israel began a military response. The allies of both Israel and Hezbollah released their respective statements on the strikes. The United States announced it would position additional US troops at forward positions in the Middle East, and international organizations emphasized the immediate need for de-escalation. But after months and months of trying to avoid such a day, Monday the 23rd marked a final, undeniable signal to the world that the moment had finally arrived. For better or for worse, and almost certainly for worse from the perspective of those caught in the middle, Israel and Hezbollah were now, for all intents and purposes, at war. We'll carry on our coverage of the Israel-Hezbollah conflict in our second installment of this series, Shock and Awe in Lebanon, and that episode should be coming to you in just a couple of days. For now, we encourage you to stay up to date with the goings-on across the Middle East, and even more important, we encourage all our viewers to keep in mind the ordinary people of both Israel and Lebanon caught in the middle of a spiraling conflict they lack the means to stop. Where this war goes won't be good for anybody, but for them, it's going to be worst of all.